Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 77 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. You have died of dysentery. Parents admonish their kids these days for staying up too late because they're playing on their tablets and smartphones. But back in the early 90s, my parents used to have to tell my brother and I to get off the trail and go to bed. In the decade before smartphones and tablets, we kids used to stay up late playing the Oregon Trail computer game. I can't say what role this game played in my desire to become a professional historian, but I used to love picking my oxen, loading my wagon with supplies, and heading out on my 8-bit version of the Oregon Trail. And I'm pretty sure I died of dysentery more often than I made it to Oregon. Since childhood, the Oregon Trail has captivated my attention. So when I saw that a journalist named Rinker Buck traversed the Oregon Trail in a mule-pulled covered wagon in 2011, and that he wrote a book about his experience, well, I knew I had to have him on Ben Franklin's World. So today, we will pack our mental Peter Shuttler wagons and head out on an exploration of the past and present Oregon Trail with Rinker Buck. During our mental journey west, Rinker reveals how he and his brother Nick came up with the idea to travel the Oregon Trail in a mule-pulled covered wagon, the history of the Oregon Trail, and why thousands of men and women traveled west, and what daily life was like on the trail for both Rinker and Nick and 19th century trail migrants. But first, if the idea of being a pioneer strikes you as fun, why not join my journey to help restore history to the forefront of the public mind? Please text support BF to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement to find out how you can help support the Ben Franklin's World movement and crowdfunding campaign. Okay, friend, I hope you've packed your mental wagon well because we're at a jumping off point for the Oregon Trail. So let's go meet our wagon train guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an adventure-seeking journalist and writer. At 15 years old, he and his 17-year-old brother became the youngest pilots to fly across the United States. In 2011, he and his brother Nick traversed the Oregon Trail in a mule-pulled covered wagon, making them the first people to travel the trail in this way in 100 years. Today, he joins us to discuss his Oregon Trail adventure. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Rinker Buck.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Rinker, before we start our conversation, I just wanted to say that I admire your passion for early American history and your desire to get in touch with it.
Oh, it's so important. You know, what we do with history right up through the college level, and then, of course, history by filmmaking, Hollywood history, is we mythologize America. It's almost like reading even some very esteemed books is like it's a promotional event for our democracy. And in fact, what happened out there isn't always as noble and as purposeful as we try and make it sound. For instance, I just finished reading the other day an essay by a conservative historian, actually, and he documented extremely well how heavily invested in Western lands all of the founders were, including Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin spent a long period of his tenure in England as the representative of the American colonies in London. He spent most of his time there trying to wrangle out of the royal family warrants to land that he'd invested in, which the crown controlled. George Washington was the wealthiest man in America of his day. He owned 60,000 acres. Very, very avaricious and ambitious man for personal investment. And what's fascinating about this is, of course, they had a motive beyond the rights of man and all the noble things that were in the Declaration of Independence. And they had a high personal business motive to do this. Well, what gets through history in high school and college and ever learns that George Washington was the wealthiest man in the country, and if he managed to liberate himself from the British crown, he would now have clear title to 60,000 acres. But we just don't teach history that way. So that's the same kind of enigmas and contradictions of our history I found when I began researching the Oregon Trail.
Let's turn to the Oregon Trail. Because, Rinker, when most 21st century Americans decide to travel or visit the trail, they get in their cars or RVs and visit state and national historic sites along the trail. But you and your brother Nick decided to see the trail in a mule-pulled covered wagon.
Right.
Where did this idea come from?
I became fascinated by the trail on a visit to Kansas. I was doing something else out there, and I just stumbled upon the trail. And it annoyed me that I knew so little about such a seminal and iconic experience for America, the experience that really defined us as an expanding continental nation. So I got very fascinated. I started reading, and the same things that I just mentioned about the founders were typical for the trail. Women played an incredibly important pathfinding role in opening up the trail, but you'd never derive that from the portraits of women in their bonnets and that sort of thing that you see in Hollywood movies. Religion played a huge role, and religion is very, very important in American history because it really sort of formed who we were, and all of our rights and everything grew out of religious rights. There wasn't a single trail. The pioneers followed really what were a collection of trails. They were terrible environmentalists for very specific reasons. The Indians were friendly until we started slaughtering them and slaughtering the buffalo. So we were killing them and we were killing their protein source. But that was only 30 years after the initial encounters with the whites. So I became fascinated by the trail and how it redounded back as a reflection of the real America, not this sort of phony Hollywood image. And then in one of my history books, I came across a single sentence which changed my mind about how to do the book, which was the last documented crossing of the Oregon Trail was in 1909. And I said, oh, well, that's a great book. Why don't I just cross the trail in a covered wagon and see it that way and describe it that way? And what happened was I grew up on a horse farm and worked my way through college driving teams and tree logging and driving harness horses for exercise. It was just my own personal autism. It never struck me. It never occurred to me, oh, you can't do this. You're not capable of doing this. So I found a wagon on the web. I found a team of mules, which I bought over the phone from an Amishman who, the Amish aren't supposed to have cell phones, but they all do, and they sneak out into the barn at night, do all their business calls, and negotiated for my team with an Amishman in Missouri, and we married everything together and took off, and it was that simple. It stopped being simple very quickly after that because it's very rough to get a covered wagon 2,000 miles to Oregon. But that's what we did. St. Joe to Baker City, Oregon. It took us 4 months, 79 camps, that sort of thing. It was a great way to write about the trail.
In the Oregon Trail, A New American Journey, Rinker discusses many of the books and diaries he read about the Oregon Trail. Rinker, would you provide us with a brief history of the trail and when and why men and women traveled west by the thousands?
Well, it wasn't a deliberate thing at first. What happened was that after the Louisiana Purchase, fur trappers flooded the near west and the far west, all the way up into the Rockies and so forth. And John Jacob Astor, who created one of the first great fortunes in America, went all the way to the Pacific and created these beaver empires. And the fur trappers married into the Indians and so forth and learned their ways. And one thing that had already occurred was that the Indians followed the buffalo all summer, and they would cross along the Platte River in Nebraska along what had been called the Great Platte River Road. Then there was a Wyoming Rocky Road, and then there wasn't really a road across Idaho, but an early mountain man type named Marcus Whitman pioneered a trail across the Snake River and so forth. So after 1843, when a mass migration of people commenced, these trails, which were old Indian traces, were essentially patched together and called the Oregon Trail, but they weren't really a deliberate Oregon Trail to begin with. And over the history of the trail, which I describe a lot of in my book, there were endless cutoffs and detour routes and ways to get around the rivers when they were high, et cetera. So there were about 40 major detours and cutoffs, actually, by the time the trail history was over at the Civil War. And the reasons for people migrating had to do with the two major factors were there was something called the Panic of 1837, which really destroyed the American economy. We were a very young, primitive economy, and there was a bank panic, and more than half the banks in America closed. Just think of that today. If more than half the banks closed, what would you do? So people lost their farms. They couldn't borrow any money to buy seed and so forth. But at the same time, the American government was anxious to settle as many Americans as we could in the Pacific Northwest because that would make it easier to make claims and finish the continental space against the British, who were there with their fur trapping empire, but they didn't really have a very strong case that it was their land. So people just started migrating naturally. The first big migration was in 1843 because they were desperate for land. They were homeless. It was like all the hobos who were roaming around in the Great Depression. So that was one factor. But the second important factor was there was a lot of religious strife in America. Something had occurred called the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s through Trans-Appalachian America and out to the frontier. And what happened was people became enamored of new evangelical religions, and it created a huge impact in America. It created the Mormons, it created the sobriety movement, and a lot of social causes. And what happened was life in small-town America became very contentious and very unpleasant. So a group of people would decide, well, they're going to go with the evangelical side of the Baptists and leave the Church of England or Dutch Reformed or whatever. And life in towns became miserable because there was so much religious squabbling. The Baptists, all the Baptists in a small town in Kentucky would decide, well, we're going to go west and seek more religious freedom out in Oregon, where there's free land anyway. And then they would get to a certain spot, say like Plum Creek or Independence Rock or whatever, and so much fun to read journals. Traveled all day, very weary, miserable mosquitoes, arrived Plum Creek to camp, but found a train of Methodists there. Traveled one more mile to camp by ourselves without the Methodists. This is what America was like in those days. So this was a big revelation for me because I've always considered American religious history very, very important. And it turns out it was a huge motive for crossing the trail. And also the Mormons added greatly. There were 70,000 Mormons that crossed on the trail. And they added greatly to trail history because they were very organized and disciplined in how they took on the trail. So those were the two big factors.
Religious strife and economic hardship are not the romantic ideas that we associate with the Oregon Trail.
But it actually makes for quite a romantic and funny story. To me, what's important is America and readers confronting the real history, their real history, not this sort of saccharine-coated handy myth that we prefer to give children in school books and stuff. So, religious strife, origins in American history, that sounds a little bit like the country we're living in right now. Economic necessity, again, we're having this huge battle. It will probably be the big battle in the presidential race this year. Economic inequality. Well, America was massively economically unequal at the time, so it drove people to the trail. There was one other factor that was so fascinating, which was the pioneers were terrible environmentalists. If they had too many bacon barrels or whatever, they would just throw them over the side. And literally by the 1850s, and you can read this in the journal, and it's literally true, you could navigate your way 2,000 miles across the Great American Desert all the way to Oregon just by following the debris pile. So one of the things that happened was when the pioneers reached the jumping off towns along the Missouri River, which was marking the frontier, places like Independence, Westport, St. Joe, Missouri, the merchants were ready for them. They knew they had about 6 weeks to squeeze every last penny they could out of these people. So there were a lot of scare tactics about, well, if you don't have a barrel of bacon for each one of your children, they're going to starve out there. And these kids were going to end up looking like baby Huey by the time they got to Oregon. And so the pioneers were overloaded, and they threw the extra barrels out when they hit the hills, and the draft animals began to strain. And one of the things that I read about that was so fascinating is the merchants who knew perfectly well that they were overloading these wagons would hide up behind the bluffs, behind this famous ridge called the South Hills, and at certain strategic points where the pioneers began dumping all their gear and their bacon and their flour and so forth, valuable stuff, they would sneak in at night, pick up all those barrels that had been thrown out, carry them back to the jumping off towns, and resell them to the next group of suckers. So America always had scammers. It always had conflict. It always had people who would take advantage of another. Isn't that a more valid knowledge of our real past than the sort of homogenized myth that we are handed in books?
When you decided to experience the Oregon Trail, how authentic of an experience did you set out to have? Did you wear the same clothes or use the same tools as 19th century migrants? And what about your wagon? Did you construct your covered wagon to period specifications?
No, and people would come up to me and say, well, where's your period dress? Where's your period dress? As if that matters. No, here's the reality of the Oregon Trail today. And I explain in the book all the reasons this is so. The trail is 2,100 miles to Oregon City on the Pacific Coast from Independence, Missouri, or St. Joe. About half of that trail is still preserved. It goes through largely rural farming and ranching areas of Nebraska, Wyoming, and Idaho. You can get on the original ruts and ride them in one case we rode them through Wyoming, we rode the original ruts for 350 miles. The other 1,000 miles has been paved over. It's usually small state or county 2-lane blacktops. And there are sections, too, where Route 80 comes in and the rail lines come in, stuff like that. And the reason for that was the trail went where people needed to go. It was used as a reverse route for commerce as soon as the pioneers got west, because they would run their cattle back from Oregon to the slaughter yards and shipping points in Omaha and other places. And then during World War I, there was a need to get processed beef to Europe very quickly, and they needed a more reliable route. And by that time, we had combustion engines and trucks. And they just paved the trail over. And so it's now Highway 36 or Highway 209, beautiful roads through Nebraska, western Nebraska especially, and Wyoming. it would have been silly for me to be, period dress and 100% authentic wagon, although we did actually go in an 1883 Peter Shuttler wagon that was completely authentic, because I needed safety lights in the back when trucks came over the hill. We found that this large American flag that we had hanging from a rear cart that we carried our provisions in was very useful because truckers could see us for miles off. Even the train engineers could see us, and they could slow the train down so they wouldn't scare their mules. I cooked on a Coleman stove. I didn't run around and try and find buffalo dung to eat my meal at night. So it was an attempt to ride the trail and say, what is the modern trail today in an authentic way? But we didn't need to be doctrinaire or fastidious about it.
Early Americans often debated the merits of draft and work animals. I've read debates between Dutch-descended New Yorkers who advocated for horses, while New Englanders chided them because oxen were superior. In the Oregon Trail computer game, I always chose the ox. But Rinker, you chose mules, and you made a great case for why they are the best animals for pulling wagons across the Oregon Trail. So Rinker, would you tell us about mules and why you chose them to pull your wagon?
Well, in the first place, there were two beasts of burden on the trail, mules and oxen. Horses were generally not used except occasionally as a riding horse because they can't stand the summer heat out west. They go 10, 15 miles and they're really pooped. But mules are much more efficient. They're half wild burro and can go long spells without water. And they're virtually, we found, our team anyway, virtually inexhaustible in terms of the amount of work they can do. So even the stagecoaches would switch to mules once they got to a certain point in Nebraska and the really dry conditions began. And then a lot of oxen were used because they too were efficient. But the problem with oxen is they only travel at about 2 miles an hour, and you have to walk on the ground and sort of prod them along with a bullwhip and that sort of thing. That's why the oxen drivers were called bullwhackers. And it's pretty tedious. I don't really know oxen very well. There's nobody out there who breeds oxen, and so you can buy them as draft animals and stuff. But mules played a continuous role in American history, and there's thousands of them out there and hundreds of really good breeders. And the mule travels at about 4.5 miles an hour at a fast walk, and they're lovely to drive. They're wonderful animals and so forth. And there was just no way I was going to turn myself into a bullwhacker and walk all the way to Oregon, driving a couple of cows. That wasn't going to work for me. So that's why we used mules. And I could go on, but in the book, there's a whole chapter about the history of the mule and how vital, absolutely vital. You cannot understand American history without understanding the role that the mules played as a beast of burden in the Civil War, dragging all the canal boats and so forth. And so it was wonderful to be traveling west in open air and beautiful wagon and everything with this iconic animal that made so much a difference in our history.
The chapter on mules was one of my favorite chapters in your book, and I think we need to talk about one aspect of that chapter here, and that aspect is George Washington was a mule breeder?
George Washington was the Maharaja of mules. What happened was, prior to the American Revolution, the British monarch's two big competitors in sort of world landscape were the French and the Spanish. And the French and the Spanish had great mules for historical reasons. They just had developed mules. The British never used mules because generally they have level terrain and horses were fine, but you need a stronger animal, the mule, whenever you get hilly country like occurs in so much of continental Europe. So the Spanish and the French crowns would not export mules. There was a ban on exporting mules to colonial America because they didn't want to provide any aid or comfort to their rivals, the British. If you remember, at this time, the French and the Spanish and the British were just fighting endless wars all the time. So after the American Revolution, when George Washington had led the effort to liberate these colonies from the British Crown, he was a global hero. And of course, the French and the Spanish crowns loved him at this point because he had wrested the colonies from their rival, Great Britain. So within about 5 or 6 years after the end of the Revolution, both the French and the Spanish sent over these mammoth jacks and jenny mules to allow the Americans to start breeding. And the gifts were sent to George Washington personally. George Washington, by the end of his life, had 60 working mules at Mount Vernon, and he was sending studs all over the colonies to breed mules. And it was George Washington himself, who was very well known as an animal breeder in other respects, who created the American mule population. The mules we took to Oregon were direct descendants of the first mama jack that was sent over, a burro called Royal Gift from the Spanish Crown. The great history of the mule in the United States began right at Mount Vernon. George Washington had a compound, and by 1820, which would be about 20 years after his death, there were more than 800,000 mules in the South and on the frontier. all originating from the original stock that George Washington received in, I believe it was 1793, somewhere in there.
What was your life like along the trail? How did you spend your days and nights? And where does one park a covered wagon and a team of mules at night?
That was the delight of the trip, that we ran into so much hospitality, and so much of the original trail was there. You'd arrive at a place like Rock Creek Station in Nebraska, which was a famous place during the development of the Wild West, but it began as a pioneer encampment. And it's now maintained by the state of Nebraska as a equine park, a camping area, RV place. So a lot of nights we just pulled into those places, literally 30 or 40, the original pioneer campground, places like Three Island Crossing in Idaho, Independence Rock in Wyoming, Pacific Springs in Wyoming. These were all original pioneer campgrounds that, just for specific reasons that I described in the book, were kept open and preserved as useful space for the public to use. So a lot of times we just pulled in there. Other times we pulled in on ranches and farms, and the people were just so happy to see us. Oh, yeah, put your mules in that corral there and get all set up, and why don't you come in for dinner? A lot of other nights we just cooked out on the open plains. But we also camped right out on the plains in Idaho. We camped on the ninth hole of the Oregon Trail Country Club near Hot Lava Springs. We camped at a truck stop one night, public parks, and so forth. And there was just a wonderful impromptu nature to the trip, just a sort of a glorious make it up as you go along. We never knew when we set off in the morning where we'd end up that night. We just wanted to do another 25, 30 miles. And we get somewhere, and just there was a rodeo going on, and they had extra corrals, and everyone said, hey, yeah, just camp here and come over and watch the rodeo when you're done. Fairgrounds, things like that. So there was a spontaneity to the trip that was wonderful that way. And as far as our days, they were long and monotonous. I would get very, very tired and afraid that I'd fall off the wagon and get crushed by the wheels. So I did a lot of walking while my brother drove the mules. And we would get in at night and wash our mules. We'd always try and find water, so we'd give the mules a nice bath. We didn't take any baths ourselves, but we always bathed the mules. And get settled. We put up temporary fencing or used a corral, keep the mules for the night. And then we had a little Coleman cook stove and just cooked up, whatever we had with us, which normally was Hormel chili, no beans. We probably ate that 5 nights a week, some weeks. Other nights we'd be sitting there and camping out in a beautiful remote area, and a pickup truck would come along, and the rancher lady would say, well, we heard you were coming through and drove around and tried to find you, and here's a tin of lasagna. I hope you'd enjoy it.
That was your experience, but what was daily life like for the 19th century trail migrants?
The great advantage we had, it was actually a disadvantage too, because we didn't have huge wagon train to help us when we got to mountainous areas, and the pioneers had stopped, unloaded their wagons, and used joint labor and joint teams to get over Rocky Ridge or California Hills, some of these places. We didn't have that advantage of a big wagon train, but we didn't have the disadvantage either. Life was crowded in the camps. I described the experience of the pioneers as actually an urban experience. They had to have the skills of urban people, because every night, 10 or 15 wagon trains would arrive at the same place. So you'd have, literally 700 or 800 families camping at the same place, because there were logical places to stop where you got to the Platte, because you knew you had to cross it the next day and you needed to get everything organized. And so that created the problem of cholera, which was a big issue, which is that it's a virus that had rampaged across the world, come up from India originally. And it turns out that the Platte River Basin in Nebraska, which is very salty, it's alkali conditions, was an absolutely ideal host area for the cholera virus. People were making it worse. You'd camp and maybe they'd dig a hole somewhere and everyone would use that as a bathroom and so forth. And this just created almost a petri dish for cholera. So 20,000 people died on the trail over the peak years of the trail history from 1843 to the Civil War, just from cholera alone. The draft animals would give out. There was a lot of conflict over a lot of the wagon trains drove cattle across, so they'd have something to eat along the way, and they also wanted the beginnings of a breeding stock once they got out to Oregon or California. And at the rivers, everybody would drive their cattle across the rivers, and on the other side, separating the cattle out and making sure you don't have somebody else's cattle and they don't have yours could create a lot of conflict. And I write about there were murders over cattle, and they'd have a trial and hang the guy and bury him in the same grave as the person he murdered, that sort of thing. So life was very romantic and dreamy, and I described that too, how the pioneers were amazed by the landscape they were confronting. But the biggest single issue that affected the quality of life on the trail was overcrowding. And in peak migration years, like 1852 or the Gold Rush year, 1849, as many as 25 or 30,000 people crossed in one summer. And that means that 25 or 30,000 people are leaving the banks of the Missouri River all within 5 or 6 weeks of each other. You have to get off by May so that you don't get caught by the snow in the mountains in September and October. 25, 30,000 people are now going to follow the exact route, or pretty much the exact route, all the way out west, 2,000 miles. Well, just think of the conflict that creates, the competition for water, for getting to the camp first, for trying to get out of somebody else's dust, et cetera, et cetera. So overcrowding on the trail, kind of a mass mentality of everybody doing something at once, was probably the single greatest factor that affected the quality of life on the trail.
Wow. So the computer game wasn't lying. People really died of dysentery, like 25,000 of them.
The only thing that happened to the pioneers that didn't happen to us was cholera. You know, we weren't out there with thousands of other people, so the cholera wasn't there. But we had, our mules ran away, we broke wheels, we flipped wagons. You know, there's one point in the book when we came down Dempsey Ridge on the last range of mountains between Wyoming and Idaho, we had to drop from 8,300 feet to 2,000 feet in about a mile and a half. It was the most perilous, frightening thing that I ever can imagine doing. And, you know, we fitted our wheels so they got so hot that you couldn't even touch the iron rims and things like that. So everything that happened to the pioneers pretty much happened to us except for cholera.
At one point in his book, The Oregon Trail, Rinker mentions that, quote, reaching the Oregon Trail in Wyoming and not confronting the Mormon experience would be like reaching Paris and not studying cathedrals, end quote. Rinker, would you tell us about the connection between the Mormon migration west from Illinois to Utah and the Oregon Trail?
The Mormons were just hugely important, and unfortunately, people, again, confront the myth and prejudice and hostility and stuff towards the Mormons instead of studying the real outgrowth. So what happened with the Mormons is there was this hugely important event in American history in the 1820s called the Second Great Awakening. And it led to questioning of religion, creating all new religious traditions, converting to evangelical churches. And it was out of that movement that Joseph Smith created the Mormons. And they were detested. They were hated because, again, it goes back to the religious strife thing. But the big thing the Mormons did, aside from polygamy and also having a very, very clannish kind of economic nature, and they were very successful financially, which made other people jealous of them. But the big thing the Mormons did, which made them hated by other Christians, is Joseph Smith believed that he had found new revealed texts. The Old Testament and the New Testament didn't completely explain religious history, and he created the Book of Mormon, which was, he claimed, new revealed text and was revealed by God to him. So they were hounded, they were persecuted, there were huge wars, the Mormons were murdered, the Mormons fought back and murdered other people. So by the late 1840s, when Joseph Smith was actually assassinated, the Mormons decided that they were going to seek their own paradise in a place so far west that other Christians couldn't get to them. And for one reason or another, they finally settled on the Salt Lake Basin in Utah. And over a period of about 35 years, more than 70,000 Mormons crossed. They were the largest single group to cross. And being Mormons, they were extremely disciplined and organized. The Mormons had the only west-east traffic. Every fall, they would send guides back. They put mile markers down so that their trains coming across could see exactly where they were. They had farms and dairies on the trail so that their people crossing would have fresh supplies. They set up a system of ferries across all the rivers. And the Mormons got to cross for free, but everybody else had to pay $1 to do the Mormon ferry. The Mormons accelerating the development of the trail and being very disciplined about organizing it. They had a postal service. It had a huge impact on the success of the trail.
You chose to end your journey at the Oregon gravesite of Narcissa Whitman. Would you tell us about Narcissa and why you chose to end your trip by paying tribute to her?
Well, Liz, when you read my book, you probably said to yourself, well, wait a minute, how come I never heard of Narcissa Whitman? And school children in states where the Oregon Trail goes through, some of them have heard about Narcissa Whitman, but not many. Narcissa Whitman was, again, a product of the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s. She came from the Finger Lake region of New York State, and during a born-again experience as a 16-year-old, she gave herself to Jesus and devoted herself to becoming a missionary to the Indians. It's sort of unclear why evangelizing the Indians was so important to her, but it was a very big Christian goal at the time. We were going to save the Indians by making them Christians. And so she had this dream, but she couldn't actualize it because she wasn't married and they wouldn't let a female travel in the West alone. But she married a guy named Marcus Whitman who had already done a lot of exploring out West. He was also an evangelical missionary, and they decided to go out and save the Cayuse tribe in Washington State, very near the Oregon border. But there was huge prejudice against this happening. Nobody believed that a white woman could cross west without being molested by the Indians. 19th century Americans were terrified of rivers because they were very, very dangerous places to cross in a wagon. The ice would fall through and everyone would be killed, bridges collapsed, and so forth. So the fear of the Indians in crossing the rivers had prevented anyone from going. And if you were going to go west, take a new claim on land, you really had to bring your family. You couldn't come all the way back the next summer and get your family after finding some land. So in 1836, Narcissa Whitman and her husband Marcus followed a fur caravan out, and Marcus Whitman knew that if he could get to Oregon in a wagon, that this would revolutionize the number of Americans who could cross. And he wanted him out there because he wanted to have more missionaries to help him evangelize the Indians. But in 1836, they followed a fur caravan all the way to Oregon. It was a trial of tribulation there. But the two fearsome issues, the Indians and the rivers, they solved all at once because Narcissa Whitman wrote these letters home that were published and that had a revolutionary impact on people wanting to take the trail. And she said, I have never had less fear of crossing rivers than anywhere else in the United States. The Indians would come into their camp at night, and a brave would stand there and hold open the flap to her tent just so the braves could look and see their first white woman. And they were very friendly. They had wonderful experiences with the chiefs and their wives and so forth. So without Narcissa Whitman, we would have had a crossing, and the pioneers would have happened anyway. But the letters of Narcissa Whitman, which were published in newspapers all over the country and even as far away as London, which showed a white woman crossing on the trail and having no problems with the Indians and crossing the rivers, often with the help of the Indians, and getting there safely. And then a few months later, they read that Narcissa Whitman had not only conceived on the trail, but successfully delivered a baby once she got to Oregon. Convinced American women and their husbands and families that it was safe to go. And it's just enormous impact. And it was Marcus Whitman himself, who just happened to be back on the frontier in 1843, who led the first train all the way to Oregon, about 1,000 people that he led in 1843. And thus the migration began.
There's a second part to this story, too, because there was an event known as the Whitman Massacre. Would you tell us about the massacre and what role it played in the history of the trail?
It's a very tragic thing, but it was kind of very interesting for me to confront and write about it. So they traveled west. The white man's burden in those days was, we're going to make these people really good Christians, and that'll solve the problem of the population of Indians in the West. Well, they got out there to a spot near Waiapatu, near Walla Walla, Washington. You can go there today. It's a national historic park. And they turned out to be just horrible missionaries, horrible. Narcissa refused to learn the Cayuse tongue herself and couldn't understand why they didn't want to learn English. She would give them all these Bible lessons, but then if they had to go off and do cherry picking, they wouldn't come to church on Sunday. And their feeling was, well, we took classes all week, why do we have to come and worship on Sunday? And so there was this great cultural clash. And in addition to that, Marcus Whitman was actually a medical doctor. The Whitman mission became more important as a place where people could stop and have their children cured of measles and mumps and that sort of thing. But the Indian children really couldn't successfully be treated by Marcus Whitman because they had no natural immunity to it as the essentially European-based pioneers did. So all of this developed into conflict. The Cayuse became very jealous of Marcus Whitman because he was a very successful trader, and hundreds of wagons, trains would come over the years, and he became quite prosperous serving the wagon trains instead of really running a mission to the Indians. And it all just kind of collapsed into a horrible moment in, I believe it was 1846, when the Indians attacked the mission and slaughtered the Whitman and a number of their children. And I just saw it as a paradigm of the American experience. Here was someone who went out to save the Indians, but in fact just ended up really helping the white migration more. And in the end, the cultural contradiction was so great that the people she went out to evangelize murdered her.
Before we move into the time warp, Lance would like to know what the most difficult part of crossing the Oregon Trail in the 21st century was.
I guess the most difficult part was stamina. We get up, on the trail by 8 in the morning, and many nights we didn't stop pushing until 8 at night. So it just took tremendous stamina and fortitude and willingness to just do the same thing over and over and over again. The river crossings were really tough. We did cross a couple of small rivers and big streams directly by plunging right into the water the way the pioneers did. But at the major pioneer ferries, mostly now there are big bridges that cross. Since we didn't have a big covered wagon train, we couldn't really float our wagons across like the pioneers did. But the mules would get up on top of these big span bridges now and panic because there's nothing in their DNA to tell them, well, I can see water on either side of me, but it's like 100 feet below me, and how do I get out of this situation? And eventually they settled down. But we had a couple of near runaways and very dangerous situations on the bridges. The last thing that was really tough was finding water. Once we got out into the high desert of Wyoming and everything, it's about 50 miles between each river. There's nothing out there. There was no one helping us. We didn't have support vehicles or anything like that. And so between Farson, which is on the Big Sandy River in south central Wyoming, and the Green River, it was 42 miles, 110 degrees out across something called the Little Colorado Desert. We had to cross that in one day. We had to get to water by that night. And we were carrying 100 gallons. I added water. We found old barrels along the way, and we converted them to water carriers and everything. But finding water in the high deserts of Wyoming and Idaho was quite a trip. And we had several days where we did a sort of a forced march of 40, 45 miles across the deserts on the original trail just to get to our next source of water. So ironically, when you adopt a form of transportation that's an earlier era, you see all the problems that earlier era had.
I was going to say your problems sound pretty similar to the ones that the 19th century migrants must have faced.
Yeah, and it was a great trip that way. And I think the book is fun to read because life became simplified. It was just how often in American life anymore do you find a situation where we have to get to water by the end of the day? That's our only goal. That's the only thing we need. Or I didn't talk about another difficulty. The thunderstorms were just amazing. And I only realized after we got back and read some more pioneer journals that I should have been more prepared for them. The Platte River Valley in the spring is famous for just violent thunderstorms. And it was quite romantic at night once we got safely into camp to sit in my covered wagon and hear the rain patter on the canvas roof and the wind blowing, rock the wagon. That was kind of cool. But mules panic if a thunderstorm comes directly over them if they're in harness because they feel they can't protect themselves. And so whenever a storm came up, and they could come up very quickly, we quickly had to rush somewhere for shelter, get the harness off the mules, either tie them up or put them in a corral and that sort of thing. So all the complexities of life were eliminated in these simple things: water, avoiding thunderstorms, understanding really rough terrain and how to get the wagon across it, things like that. And it was just delightful in a way, though. At the end of the day, I had this intense satisfaction of having battled very simple elemental forces to get where I wanted to go.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Rinker, in your opinion, what might have happened if gold had not been discovered in California and the young United States had experienced fewer economic panics? How would the history of the Oregon Trail be different?
It would have delayed, it would have retarded the massive migration, but I don't think it would have eliminated it. The desire of Americans to have a fully completed continental space was insatiable. And you have to remember that most of the land that people were acquiring when they went across was free. And then after the Homestead Act during the Civil War, which President Lincoln signed because he wanted a place for veterans of the war to be able to go, in much the same way we have a GI Bill now, there was an insatiable drive to get there. But obviously, with 25,000 people crossing just for the gold rush in California in 1849, you would have had a much smaller trail, much more of a trickle, and I think it would have just taken a longer time. I also think California would have been much, much less an important state. Most of the people would have just gone to Oregon instead if there was no gold in California. So I think the development would have been slower, but it still would have happened. And I'll give you just one factoid to support that. In the early 1840s, the American government, Polk administration, the Buchanan administration, decided that it would be a very good idea to flood the Pacific Northwest with Americans because the British claimed it, but they couldn't defend what is now called Northwest Territories and what is now Washington State and Oregon. There were 500 British subjects in the Pacific Northwest in 1845, and there were 90% of them were employees of the Hudson's Bay Company. There was a big migration that began in 1843. By 1846, there were 5,000 Americans in the Pacific Northwest. We dominated them by 10-1, and it was literally a question of an ambassador being sent to Great Britain after that, at that point, and just negotiating the British surrender of those two provinces below Canada. So, to me, it was really over in 1845 because we took Oregon and Washington State and finished our continental space by squatters' rights. So if it had been more of a trickle after that, and there hadn't been a gold rush, and there hadn't been all the financial panics, I still think the insatiable desire of Americans to push west would have been the same, though smaller and in lesser numbers.
What's next for you? What's your next historical adventure?
Well, I hate to share anything because, it could always not work out. But what drew me to the Oregon Trail book was the opportunity to write about an epic period of history that most people didn't really have accurate information on. So there's another period, and that was the flatboat era. Very few Americans realized that America as a global trading empire emerged because of simple farmers and simple boatmen making flatboats and plunging them down the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River system. And these were huge things carrying hundreds of tons of grain and so forth at the same time, and exited to global markets through New Orleans, the bottom of the Mississippi. So I'm going to take the Mississippi on a flatboat and revive this period so people understand, well, how did we get to be such an international trading economy? And it all happened between 1820 and 1870 or so along the Mississippi River.
Images of Huck Finn and Abraham Lincoln are floating through my mind right now.
I'm going to have a great chapter on Lincoln, and there's some real surprises about Lincoln that most people don't know about, and I'm not going to tell you. You have to read the book in a few years. But Abraham Lincoln's relationship to the Mississippi is critical. You can't understand his presidency, and you can't understand the Civil War without understanding Abraham Lincoln's relationship to the Mississippi. And, of course, he took 2 flatboat trips as a young man himself. I'll probably have a whole chapter on Mark Twain and how he brought the Mississippi to the consciousness of the American public. And there's a lot of really interesting things about Huck Finn, which is generally, along with 2 or 3 other novels, perhaps Moby Dick and so forth, credited by almost everyone with the great American novel. And it took Twain 7 or 8 years to write that book. So, yeah, going to float down the Mississippi and see if I make it alive. And if I do, I can get a book out of it.
Well, we'll look forward to that. In the meantime, where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can get in contact with you should we have questions about the Oregon Trail?
There's a Facebook page. You can just type into Google Rinker Buck and the Oregon Trail, and it'll pop right up. There's some great books out there. I mean, if my book isn't enough, a guy named John D. Unruh Jr. wrote a wonderful book called The Plains Across, which is sort of the encyclopedic journal or description of all of the trail experiences and pioneer history. And another great historian named Merrill Mattis wrote a wonderful book called The Great Platte River Road, and that's all about the Nebraska stretch of the trail and how the trail got started. So there's a lot more supplemental reading you can do. State historical societies and something called OCTA, which is the Oregon and California Trails Association, have wonderful websites. You can go online and read pioneer journals. You can buy a huge number of the pioneer journals that I quote in my book. You can actually buy in published form. And the Mormons also have a huge historical effort, and you can go on the Church of Latter-day Saints LDS website and their Mormon history sections, and you could sit there for weeks just reading the different monographs and pioneer journals of the Mormon crossing. So there's a huge amount out there. If you just poked around on the internet a little and went on book sites like Amazon and just typed in Oregon Trail, you'd be amazed what comes up.
Rinker Buck, thank you so much for sharing your Oregon Trail adventure with us.
Liz, this was great. I really enjoyed it, and I love your site.
It's clear from Rinker's description of life on the Oregon Trail that the computer game doesn't quite do the experience of trail life justice. I know that's asking a lot from an 8-bit graphic computer game, but still. Approximately 25,000 trail migrants died of cholera, a side effect of which was dysentery. Theft and conmen were common at jumping off and stopping points, and these were common parts of trail life that trail migrants needed to deal with. It was fascinating to discover the impact Mormons had on the development of the Oregon Trail. They had mile markers, supply depots, mail service, and ferry crossings. Honestly, it sounds like having Mormons on the trail may have made the crossing a bit easier for all migrants, at least through Salt Lake City. But it's also clear from Rinker's description of the trail, both in the past and in the present, that daily life on the trail was hard and monotonous. Sure, you have scenic views, but the idea of crossing the plains without water is frightening. As is the idea that you might fall asleep, fall off your wagon, and be crushed by your wagon wheels. Or that your animals might bolt and leave you stranded in a place far from home and without water. I'm not sure about you, but while I greatly enjoyed our mental crossing of the Oregon Trail, I'm not sure I'm prepared to reenact a crossing like Rinker's anytime soon. You can find more information about Rinker, his book The Oregon Trail, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/077. If you decide to travel the Oregon Trail or anywhere else, be sure to take Ben Franklin's World with you. You can do this by subscribing to the podcast or by downloading its free iOS or Android app. To download the app, visit your favorite app store or visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps. If you love this episode, would you please tell your friends, family members, and acquaintances about it? The best way for a podcast to find new listeners is by word-of-mouth recommendations, and I would really appreciate yours. Finally, after hearing Rinker's stories, are you keen to try a crossing of the Oregon Trail in a mule or oxen-pulled covered wagon? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.